first presentation from Dr. Jana Compton, who is a senior research ecologist with the University of U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and she's based in Corvallis, Oregon, and she's been there for 25 years. She has a background in forest soil, and biogeochemistry, and uses ecosystem and watershed approaches to understand the sources of nutrients, their fate, their impacts, and how to manage them to address issues in water quality. And what you'll see in her presentation is that her work spans scales from the field scale in farms to the conterminous United States. And all of that information is used to inform decision-making in the U.S. government. And so, Dr. Compton, thank you.
So I want to acknowledge my co-authors, in particular Robert Sabo, who has published a lot on phosphorus from EPA recently, and Yongping Yuan, who's here, and Ann Ray, who I work with. We're all in EPA's Office of Research and Development, which is the research arm of EPA. So EPA has the program offices who kind of set national regulations and policy. Then we have the regional offices who work with the states to implement those policies. And then we have the research arm, which is about 10% of the agency, but is really the research to support the science that EPA does. And I also want to acknowledge Alan Herlihy, who has worked with EPA for a very long time. I'm going to be speaking about the phosphorus cascade, navigating from sources to solutions, so I'll kind of walk you through that subject matter. And I just want to, most of the work that I've been doing since I've been with EPA for 25 years is related to nitrogen. I might accidentally say nitrogen every once in a while, but it's important. I think it's important that we look at both elements, of course. That might be a theme that comes across, but I did study phosphorus cycling for my PhD work, and in the recent 5 or 8 years, been really focusing in on adding phosphorus to our inventory and to our understanding of driver water quality interactions. So the key research interest that I'm going to speak with you about today involves quantifying non-point source pollution. It's challenging, but it's very important. We need to do a better job of this, and I'm going to tell you about EPA's National Nutrient Inventory. We're also going to use EPA's National Aquatic Resources Survey to connect the inventory, the sources, the inputs to water quality. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about some of my most recent work where we're trying to answer the question, always answering the question, is it working? Are the things that we're doing on the ground actually making a difference in terms of water quality? It's a challenge, but that's where we need to be right now. So I'm going to start with the nitrogen cascade because I think it's a great model for thinking about biogeochemistry and the cycling of these nutrients, and the sources on the left, human needs for energy, agriculture and food, the cycling of nutrients within the system, so we have different ecosystems. And the reason it's called a cascade is one molecule, one atom of nitrogen can do multiple things in the environment. It can go up in the air, it can fall down, it can have all these different effects. And phosphorus is similar, I think. And then we have all these impacts these are just examples of some of the impacts related to nitrogen. For example, drinking water contamination, health effects of smog, coastal hypoxia. I could go on for 10 minutes, but I won't. So I wanted to come up with the phosphorus cascade as well. I looked at Graham McDonald's excellent paper from 2016, but it's a little more complicated, and I couldn't show it in a slide. So also using the STEPS roadmap, which I think is really nice if you haven't looked at that yet. I used a lot of the inspiration there, but I wanted to simplify it and use these icons to kind of talk about where phosphorus comes from in a natural setting, erosion, wildfire, and weathering, and then in anthropogenic inputs involve industry and mining that removes phosphorus from inert forms and moves it into the environment. And so it can be cycled through these green arrows within terrestrial systems and then moving into surface water, groundwater, and coastal systems. And then on the right-hand side, I wanted to include some of the impacts. And I tried to be fairly thorough, although I'd love to hear if there's other things that I should be adding. But in terms of eutrophication, we have things like hypoxia, effects on food webs, fish kills. We have, in terms of the externalities that lead to damage cost, we have recreation and property value changes. And then within eutrophication, we kind of have a small subset of cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms, which have gotten a lot of attention lately. We can have recreation closures, no swim, no contact with the water. We have health impacts for people, pets, farm animals, and wildlife. We have drinking water, treatment costs, and the health impacts associated with those cyano-harmful algal blooms, which lead to the cyanotoxins. So kind of getting the picture of all these impacts, I start from that system perspective and thinking about all the sources, many of the impacts, and the fates in the environment. So the outline today, I'm going to talk about the phosphorus inputs from our nutrient inventory. I'm going to use EPA's National Aquatic Resources Survey to talk about connections between inputs and water quality. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about phosphorus management next steps, using some of Young Ping's work on the agricultural conservation practice effectiveness that was just published, and conservation prioritization using the idea of the nutrient surplus. And I'll explain that moving forward. So this is all the fluxes in the National Nutrient Inventory for phosphorus that we published in 2021 in JGR Biogeoscience. Robert Sabo was the lead on that work. We start with, the demand here, and then we have inputs, we have livestock removal, we have the terrestrial cycles, and that includes a lot of the things that I showed on the previous slide with agroecosystems, landfills, human inputs, or urban inputs, mining, wildfires, industry. And then we have point source loading coming out of the terrestrial surplus. We have crop harvest coming out of the terrestrial surplus, or coming out of the terrestrial system. And then we don't actually do anything with the inputs to groundwater or surface water. We'd like to do that in the future, but we don't have that information yet in the inventory. And this is what the inventory looks like if you put all the numbers together for the conterminous US. I've spent a lot of time looking at the nitrogen version of this, which is very complex because we have all these gaseous forms and air particulate forms. But here, I was really surprised to note that livestock waste, this is excreted livestock waste, is the largest source of phosphorus to the United States, to the conterminous United States, or CONUS. I mean, I'll be saying a lot. Farm fertilizer is the second largest input, and then we have some smaller inputs. Human waste is obviously very important. Atmospheric deposition, we used a global model to get at that, and it's important. I think we need to do a better job of measuring that and monitoring it. Non-farm fertilizer, which is residential fertilizer, and we also quantified pesticide use, the phosphorus part of pesticide. And then you can see in terms of the outputs, about half goes into crop removal, and about half stays in the system as a surplus. So what's in the inventory, mostly we're tracking anthropogenic inputs. We don't have a weathering component or an erosion component in this work. How do we use it? We track pollution over time. We identify the largest or the dominant source for different areas. We can use this to communicate. We use a lot of pie charts in communicating this, and I'll show you more pie charts than you can eat, as somebody said when they heard my practice talk. Communicating this information and explaining patterns in water quality over time and space. And so this is what the inventory, total inputs in 2012. We measured 2002, 2007, and 2012. This is what it looks like, and the darker the brown, the larger the input. So you can see some of the hotspot areas. A lot of these are agricultural regions of the country. And this is at the 8-digit HUC, so that's the scale that we're working at, is the 8-digit HUC. And a lot of this data comes from NUGIS, which is the Fertilizer Institute product. We used a lot of that data, which is at the HUC 8 scale. We can also track changes over time. We can see the increases here on the right. You can see in the red, there's been increases in the center of the country and other agricultural areas, and actually decreases between 2002 and 2012. We see decreases in some areas of the country, and so those are things to keep an eye on, of where we're seeing positive things happening. We also track the phosphorus surplus, which is the difference between all the inputs to agricultural systems and the outputs in crop harvest. And so you can see here the surplus surplus is fairly high in a lot of the country. Most of the country, the surplus is fairly high. And then we also see changes in the surplus, which here we see in the Corn Belt, we see increases in phosphorus surplus over time, and those are things to kind of keep an eye on and think about, and I'll come back to this toward the end. We can also look at each of those HUC-8s, and we can say, what is the largest source to the HUC-8? Not the dominant source, but the largest source. And so we identify for the country as a whole, and this is from 2002, that manure, livestock manure, and this is excreted livestock manure. We can talk about the right way to define that. We have multiple ways to define, to get our hands around the manure. Oh, that's a terrible image, but to talk about the manure in the inventory, we have a lot of ways to do that. But we're using excreted waste in this, and also excreted human waste in this, in our inventory that I'm presenting today. So you can see livestock manure, it kind of reflects that it is the largest source across the country, and it's the largest source spatially as well. In green, we have farm fertilizer, the largest source. In purple, we have, in yellow is where human waste is the largest source. You can see a lot of the urban areas, especially in the Northeast and other places. In Puget Sound, it's about 65% of what goes into Puget Sound. Somebody's got a hand up?
Yeah, question. How did you incorporate enrichment of soil bank? So,
That's not in here. This is just inputs to the watershed. And I'll show maps of the surplus, really, I think, is what is enrichment of the soil bank. That's what that is, and I'll talk about that as we go. Yeah?
Could you distinguish, what is the difference between, is livestock, all livestock waste?
Yes.
Or, including,
Yeah. That
waste that's manure that's applied as fertilizer?
Yes.
Okay.
All of the waste, and I can answer questions about that later. Deposition in purple, so there's not a lot of areas where deposition is important, but you'll see when we start looking at our watersheds that there are some changes. And then where we have urban fertilizer, very limited areas where urban fertilizer is the largest source. It's not to say these other sources aren't important, this is just the largest source, gives us a way to look at the whole country. We can also look under the hood a little bit in some of these aspects. We have measurements of, you can look at livestock waste by itself, you can look at crop removal by itself, you can look at the changes over time in these different forms and kind of try to understand the drivers behind the large-scale patterns that we see. And then just briefly, we are starting to put together the next generation. So we published the nitrogen and the phosphorus inventory. The phosphorus was published in 2021. We're starting to work on this next generation that works with more current data. We'd like to have an up-to-date inventory, but it's very hard to get this data. We do have the USGS has compiled 2017 up through 2017, so we're starting to work with that. We're also downscaling to HUC-12, so we have finer resolution maps, and then we can also look at more continuous time trends. So for example, manure is steadily increasing, and with the fertilizer, we kind of have some odd peaks. The economic dip in 2008, and it looks like going up and up with fertilizer. So these are things that we're going to be looking at, information that should be publicly available. Since we're a federal agency, everything's publicly available. All this data is publicly available if you want to play with it or work with it. In early 2025, we're working on that. So next, I want to talk about connecting inputs and water quality. So the background for this and the reason that we have the National Aquatic Resources Survey really stems from people like the first administrator of EPA, Bill Ruckelshaus, saying, what do you mean you don't know how many acid lakes there are? We need to know that for our policies. We know Bill Riley, who was EPA administrator in the 80s under Reagan, he said, good news, based on my years in the environmental movement, I think the agency does a great job of protecting public health and the environment, but the bad news is that I can't prove it. And one of the senators just said, are our waters getting better or worse? And so EPA developed the National Aquatic Resources Survey to address these questions. And I'll explain it in the next slide, but basically we have 4 different surveys. There's the rivers and streams, there's the lakes, there's the wetlands, and there's the coastal assessment. And so the lab that I work at in Corvallis is involved in a lot of the statistical design of these surveys. And so we spend a lot of time talking about these data and using these data. I'm mostly going to talk about the streams, rivers and streams assessment data, and a little bit about the lakes data today. So this is kind of the sample frame for that assessment, and it's about for the National Rivers and Streams Assessment, it's about 2,000 samples every 5 years. The field visit, so they send out a crew from the states to measure all this stuff. And they spend 1 day and they capture all this information. And so they're looking at physical habitat, stream flow, measures of human disturbance, insects, fish, algae, a whole bunch of other stuff that I can't even think of right now, and water chemistry, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about. It's a probability statistical design that that allows you to develop weighted estimates of the entire CONUS stream length, and it's 1.4 million miles to estimate for those areas. And then the 2018-19 data was just released, so you can go find that on the internet. If you just Google that, you'll find that data, and it's a really nice web report that you can look at all the different components. So this is what our NRSA samples, National Rivers and Streams Assessment samples, look like across the U.S. This is between the 3 surveys between 2000 and 2014, color-coded by the time frame, and it's about 5,000 samples. And you remember, if you look at the previous map, there's lots of areas of the country where we don't have permanently flowing waters, or flowing waters, they say, and so we have some blank spots on the map, but this is really what it looks like in the density of data that we're working with. So it's a lot of data. It's very spatially extensive, but we don't have repeat samples. So the temporal part, we don't have a lot of repeat samples. So we're not looking at the temporal piece here. That's kind of for other efforts and other agencies. And so with each of those dots on the map, we can go in and delineate the watershed and say what's the largest source for each of those points on the map. And so for each of our NRSA samples, we can say what is the largest source. And you can see it kind of reflects that inventory map that I showed you before, but there's some other aspects. You can see how important atmospheric deposition is in the west, in the northeast, and the upper Midwest, and to some extent in the southeast. Farm fertilizer, obviously very important in the middle of the country. Livestock waste, important in many other areas. And there are limited places where human waste, plus this also includes urban fertilizer, residential fertilizer, non-farm fertilizer in there. And then we can look at the proportion, because of that weighting, we can look at the proportion of U.S. stream length for each of these sources. And so you can see the largest source, about 39% of those 1.4 million miles of streams. 39%, the largest source is livestock waste. So that's really important to keep in mind. Hopefully we'll be talking about that more over the next 2 days. 27% is crop fertilizer, farm fertilizer. It's the largest source. 20% about is depositions, the largest source, and then human waste. Plus residential fertilizer is the smallest of those largest sources, but still very important. You see where it's important, those are the things we need to be concerned about. And so I'm going to connect this to condition. We use a reference site approach to look at the condition, since I think we're going to hear more about this in the future, that states, we don't have numeric nutrient criteria for all the states. It's very challenging to develop criteria, and I'll just leave it at that because I think we're going to hear more about that this afternoon. But we developed an approach to look at reference sites, and Alan Herlihy was a key person working on this. And so this is my best attempt to show you what that looks like. This is the different ecoregions. There's 9 ecoregions that are used in the NRSA, and then we have the concentration ranges of good, which is like the best, below the 75th percentile of the best condition site. So it's kind of a little bit of a professional judgment of what a good site is or what a reference site is. But those are, you can see in the Northern Appalachians, Southern Appalachians, Western Mountains, you have a lot more systems that have very low phosphorus concentrations, and so the good, fair boundary is kind of low. And then as you move into the plains, we have the good, fair boundary increasing. And so we have the ability to go in and say what proportion across the whole country, based on this ecoregional approach, what proportion of the country, proportion of the stream miles in CONUS are in these different condition categories. And what we see Jim, I think, mentioned what proportion is in good condition or poor condition, and it's 60% of the waters measured between 2000 and 2014 are in poor condition with respect to phosphorus, 22% or 21% in fair, and only 19% in good. So I was a little shocked when I saw this as well, that it's a very high number and based on these phosphorus concentrations. And so the 2018-19 report just came out, so I'm going to show you some of the time trend information from that. This is nitrogen, about 36% is in good, 44% is in poor condition, and that really hasn't changed over time. It's kind of been constant. For phosphorus, we see a little bit more bouncing around, and we actually saw a decline in 2013-14 in quality, so more poor sites. But then in 2018-19, we've seen an improvement, appears to be an improvement. So I would love to talk with others about this. I would love to know what you're seeing at your own field sites and your own places, because this really is kind of zooming out and taking a big picture approach. But this is kind of what we're seeing. And I also want to just mention, this is not about biological condition, but we often see where we have poor nutrient condition, we have poor biological condition as well. We can also look across the ecoregions and look at the poor, fair, good ratios of the different ecoregions. And you can see there's, especially in the south, in the southern Appalachians, the southern plains, central plains, temperate plains, upper Midwest, and northern Appalachians, we all have more than 50% of the streams that are in poor condition with respect to phosphorus. We have a little bit better, but still about a third of the systems in the west and in the xeric areas are in poor condition. We can also kind of flip this and look at the proportion of the stream miles that have different largest source. And so for the country, it was 39% was manure, but if you look at the different ecoregions, you see a lot of different patterns. And so we can see, for example, in the coastal plains, more than 3/4 agricultural sources are the largest source, same thing in the southern plains. In the northern plains, almost all of the sources are agricultural. In the temperate plains as well, the same story. And you can see where human waste becomes more important in the southern Appalachians and the Northeast. But this allows us to kind of zoom in and start looking more closely at what the drivers are in different places. We could do a pie chart for each of the Huck 8s on this map. I'm not going to do that, but I don't know how to do that, but maybe someone can help me figure it out. We can also use this information to help us understand what the drivers of water quality are. And this is data from the streams and rivers on the left, the lakes on the right. And you can see the inputs are the big drivers of streams and rivers. This was just published in JGR Biogeosciences last fall. Inputs are very important. Fertilizer, agricultural legacy, which is adding that surplus up over time. Those are the important drivers of the streams. And then for lakes, it's internal lake factors like depth. Lake depth is really important for a lot of the things that we look at in terms of the lake biogeochemistry. I'm not a lakes person. I know some people in the room are, but it looks like lake depth is a really, really key factor, and so that's something that we'll be looking at more. We've also been trying to tie this data to things like chlorophyll A and trophic state. So we have a paper that's in review looking at different trophic state categories, and total nitrogen and phosphorus in the lake, as well as lake depth, are really important predictors of that. And then finally, working with Amalia Handler to look at the relationship between things like microcystin, which is one of the cyanotoxins that I mentioned earlier, and seeing where the risk of cyanotoxins are and how that's associated to nutrient levels. Both nitrogen and phosphorus, I think, are important to consider. So just to kind of summarize the source condition findings, we have an improvement in condition possibly in 2018-19. We also see that agricultural sources, this is just a different way of slicing that pie, but farm fertilizer, 66% of the systems where farm fertilizer is the largest source are in poor condition, similar for livestock waste, slightly better for the other input types. And so policies and management to improve condition are going to differ by region and by state and by source. So finally, I'm going to end by talking about phosphorus management. I just want to point to, I don't have a lot of time to go through all the results, but Young Pink just put together a special collection in this journal of the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers that looks at all kinds of agricultural conservation practices and reviews their effectiveness. And I'm just going to give one example here. This is for wetland effectiveness for nitrogen and phosphorus removal, and it's surface runoff versus subsurface. And so we have surface runoff, a lot of removal of surface runoff, of these elements in surface runoff, percent removal. In the subsurface, we're not doing quite as well, and you actually see kind of a difference between total nitrogen and nitrate versus things that might be affected by redox, like ammonium, total phosphorus, and dissolved inorganic phosphorus. And so we see some mixed results, and I think this kind of information is really important. Keeping this in mind, looking at both nitrogen and phosphorus in our management is going to be key. So next I'm going to quickly, because I don't have a ton of time, I'm going to quickly go through some of the conservation practices and try to answer that question, is it working? And one thing quickly to say, the SEEP report came out in 2022. We see reductions in surface runoff. We're doing a good job with that, with our conservation practices. Subsurface leaching has increased quite a bit for both nitrogen and phosphorus. And that's just kind of something we need to acknowledge and deal with. We are using the surplus. So this is that map of surplus that somebody asked about earlier. What's left behind in the soil for nitrogen and for phosphorus. Note that they're slightly different. You see where the hot spots are for that surplus. And we use this as a guide. So all the yellow and red areas on the map, those are where we consider to be high surplus. And so we're going to focus in on those areas and say, what conservation should we be doing in those places? And this is all at the Huck 8, just to remind you. So we look at the nutrient surplus. If they're low, we kind of throw them out, and those areas will be white on the next map. If they're high, then the nutrient use efficiency comes. Next question is, what's the nutrient use efficiency? So we can look at that in our inventory. We have crop removal and all the inputs. We can calculate NUE for both N and P, and then we can say, is it low or high? And then if it's high, we can move into edge of field, because we're doing everything we can mostly on the field to reduce the surplus. We could probably do more, but we are doing a lot to reduce the surplus. Then we move into the edge of field. And the edge of field, you might be talking about things like tile drain. This is a recently published map of tile drain across the US, or of potentially restorable wetlands based on soils and landscape position. These are the areas where we have potential to restore wetlands. And then, so we can look at the edge of field conservation approaches, tile drain, how to manage that, buffers, how to manage that, restoration. Do we have good restoration opportunities, or do we need to look at things outside of the wetland context for improvements? I also want to emphasize we can stack these things. We don't need to just do one or the other. We want to stack, and that's kind of a key thing that the NRCS folks are thinking about, is the stacking idea. And then just proportion of the country, about 50% of the country has high surplus. So there's about 50% of the CONUS that we need to be looking at some of these issues. In-field reduction is recommended for 44 to 45% of the US, that we need to be looking at this. I should be saying this louder. I feel like this is one of the most important findings of Lily Kirk's work. And then the stacking and edge of field is probably about 30%, 29 to 35%, depending on the element. And I noticed one of your STEPS roadmap things is optimizing use, and that really fits into this in-field reduction. Hopefully we'll get to talk more about that. So just showing you the map, as I mentioned, the white areas are places where surplus is not high, at least at the Huck 8 scale. That doesn't mean there's no problems here or no issues. It's just what our scale tells us. And we have the low nutrient use efficiency, where we want to look at in-field conservation. We have areas of high nutrient use efficiency, like in some areas of the Corn Belt. We actually grow corn really well. We have high nutrient use efficiency with corn, like 70% or greater nutrient use efficiency, which was our threshold. But we still have high surplus, and so we need to figure out what to do in those situations. One thing that is kind of next on my to-do list is to start to work with conservation data. So if anybody has data, especially if it's at the CONUS scale, please talk to me, because we're trying to assemble this and look at it. And I'm gonna, do I have time? I think I better, okay. I have a lot of slides. But I want to quickly use an example from the Hypoxia Task Force report, which just came out last December, the latest one. And I'd recommend, if you're interested in this sort of thing, to look at that. It's led by EPA, but it's a cooperative of states and USGS as well. USGS, about 8 to 10% is either nitrogen, of either nitrogen or phosphorus, comes from human waste, wastewater treatment plants. The rest is from non-point sources, which a lot of that includes agricultural sources. And they're using these metrics largely in blue here. This is the time trend of export from the mouth of the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. And this map, this is not the prettiest map, but it shows you the time, the flow normalized nitrogen load going down over time, and the flow normalized phosphorus load kind of starting to go down, going up, and then now going down again. And so these blue bars are actually the actual load, but the dark blue is the flow normalized, because we can't really control climate or rainfall directly. And so the rainfall is kind of backed out of the calculation. So this is saying what factors on land are affecting nitrogen and phosphorus. And so what we're seeing is from the baseline of 1980 to 1996, we've seen about a 20% reduction in that flow-weighted nitrogen, flow-normalized nitrogen load. We see but we're seeing a 3% increase in phosphorus. So that may be something to think about. We need to maybe do a better job. We might be able to use the inventory to help us along those lines. But I want to just end by saying a couple of key take-homes. The non-point source pollution is challenging, but we can start to get our hands around it. We're building these great data sets. Many folks are working on this. Nandita Basu's lab in Waterloo is doing a lot of great work as well. There's a lot of research opportunities. I would say phosphorus deposition, managing for NMP reductions, and obviously the animal system manure question is very important, as you all know. And then just 42 to 60%, depending on the year, of U.S. waters are in poor condition for phosphorus. We need better information. And I want to thank all of my colleagues that have worked on this, especially a lot of the postdocs that worked with me over the years through the ORISE program. If you have students that are looking for jobs, look at ORISE, because EPA has a lot of opportunities. And for some reason, there's a lot of ASU connections with these folks. So I just wanted to, for Jim's benefit, I wanted to say that, because there's just something about the education, or maybe the water, I don't know, but something about the education that folks are getting here that makes for a good fit for the work that we do at EPA. So I'll stop there, and thanks.
And I just wanted to comment that brilliant work, mind-blowing amount of data, and much of it is exactly the kind of data we need for a lot of things that we need to find out. But I'm reminded of, I've been doing this working on the phosphorus sustainability thing for about 15 years now, or more like that. And we gather all the brilliant minds from around the world, PhDs, all kinds of areas, and all kinds of brilliant people. And at the end of the day, we end up talking about cow manure. That's where it always comes back to. So you brought it out again, that manure management is one of the biggest things that we face, and figuring out what to do with it and make it useful to society rather than a detriment is one of the things we're looking for.
Thanks for the great talk. My question was, how does pumping of the groundwater affect the partitioning and of surface water nutrient runoff versus subsurface nutrient runoffs, and is there some sort of correlation there?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do work in the Willamette Valley. We do use a lot of groundwater for irrigation, and I'll just say it's something that we have to include in our farm balances in the Willamette Valley, because you can add anywhere from 10 to 40 kilograms of nitrogen to the system, which is kind of not a small amount. Kilograms per hectare, and so you need to account for that. So I'm thinking more along the biogeochemical angle. I'm not a hydrologist, so I don't think I can answer the part about how the pumping affects the shift. But certainly we're not doing a very good job of reducing the leaching part. It's hard to measure, because I do that. That's what I've been doing since that was my graduate work, is measuring nitrate leaching or phosphorus leaching. It's really hard to do. It's expensive. We can't just go out and take a grab sample. And so But I think we probably need more of that kind of data to better understand what we're doing. And I don't really know if a lot of work on phosphorus and groundwater, so anybody's working on that topic or wants to talk more, I would be interested to hear about it, because I tried to work on it with a state partner, and they said, oh, we don't care, we are not really interested in phosphorus and groundwater, so. Hi.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I have excellent talk. I have a few questions I want to ask you.
Just one.
Okay, just one.
I'll catch you after.
Yeah, we'll catch you later. So there, what's the biggest surprise on the first part of the 10-year survey? And that's the first. Well, I'll start with that one. But I have to ask this one, like on the takeaways. And do you think we are applying too much phosphorus fertilizer? Because you have the managing for N and a P reduction on there.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, was that? Should I answer?
So I had 3 questions, but I'm only allowed to ask one. So what would be, what do you think of this one?
Yeah,
Go ahead and
so
talk about it.
I can't really say, I mean, I'm not an agronomist, so I'm not going to say we're adding too much. I think we are having too much surplus, I'll say. We're having too much surplus nitrogen and phosphorus in many parts of the country. And so whatever it is that we need to do to reduce that surplus, which is, potentially what ends up going to streams, back up into the air, going into the environment, I think that's what we need to, I personally think that's what we need to be looking at, is reducing the surplus. And if reducing inputs is part of that, then that may be part of the solution. But I really think it's an important question for the crop advisors and the agronomists to be talking about.
Okay.
Back here.
Yeah.
Hi, Jana.
Hi.
Thanks for this presentation. My question is, so we had the Rivers and Lakes Assessment Report come out. We had the Epoxy Task Force report to Congress come out. How is EPA viewing these 2 reports? Because they're giving conflicting observations in their analysis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are, and so these reports are released by the Office of Water, which is the program office that I mentioned earlier. But I think, I think that a lot of the rivers and streams assessment, that is small streams. The Gulf of Mexico, the Hypoxia Task Force report is what's coming off of the landscape and going into the Gulf of Mexico. So they're not really measuring exactly the same thing. But I do think that there's some things to reconcile. And I think especially for phosphorus, we're seeing those kind of things bouncing around for phosphorus. And we would really like to have a better handle on what the drivers are and what's causing some of those changes. That's really important. So I don't think they're necessarily directly in conflict with each other. They're telling us slightly different things. And also I think the message that I'm hearing is that we need to spend time and better understand what's going on the landscape. I think
Great.
that was the right
I just want to say, I'm not convinced that phosphorus loading to the Gulf of Mexico is going down at the end of your time series. I'd like to see a GAM fit to that. That looked like it was going up to me. But in any case, Becca has one. Last one.
Hey, Jana. Yeah, I'm last. I submitted this online, but I'll just ask. A lot of the work that you've done is, really cool and important, but a lot of it, and we face the same challenges based on data that's very, very sparse. Like a recent report from Duke said that less than 20% of our basins in the U.S. have a monitoring observation in the last 2 years. Plus the input data, which is once every 5 years. Chickens have a turnover of every, 6 to 8 weeks, and we have one number for 5 years for most counties. So how is the EPA thinking about addressing these very basic data needs to be able to make this work even more refined?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I struggle with it a lot. I would emphasize what you said. I think, that is, I probably should have put that one first, that tracking the inputs is probably one of the most important things that we can do to improve our data. Working together across agencies and across, with academics, because there's a lot of folks that are doing amazing work on the input side in academia. Bob Howarth's group, the group with Nandita Basu at Waterloo that are quantifying these nutrients, looking at it from different perspectives. Working more with USDA, honestly, I think is going to be key to help us get those more refined estimates and have a better idea of what's going on over space and hopefully over time as well. So I think it really involves partnering up and working together more on, and some of this is challenging data to get a hold of. That's the nature of non-point source. So thanks for that question, though.
Let's give Dr. Compton a big hand for that.